Hello, this is On Imagination with the Healing Garden. And this is the Irish series. So yesterday I went into a bar and a couple bars and found some people to talk to who were born and raised in Ireland. And I was able to sit down and ask her a series of questions. And I kept the questions vague because I wanted to see how she directed and where she took the conversation. And right off, I asked her what the difference was, the primary difference that she noticed between Irish culture and every other culture, what it looked like from an insider. Now, I've got that outside point of view where I know what it looks like on the outside. So I can look at it and say, this is how their culture is different. But I wanted to hear her answer on the inside. And this is an hypothesis I realized yesterday. This is yesterday morning and then earlier the night before. I was talking to a dear friend of mine about art, and we were looking into the problem with art in our culture, Western culture, and how it's depreciated, or not depreciated, but it's not valued. And going over what could be done to increase the value of it, why it's not valued. And so I recorded a video and I started to explore that. And when I did that, I looked to Ireland because Ireland's views on art is very different from everyone else's. In fact, it's unheard of. And I wondered why. So I took a step back and I went, that's something I loved about Ireland. It's one of the reasons why I've always been drawn to her, is because their appreciation for art, value, all of it has always been, their entire culture has always valued art, books, literature, and education above all else. And I never really wondered why. I don't know why. That's so unlike me. But I never really analyzed why. I just thought, oh, it's part of their culture. And in my conversations with this friend of mine, I was recalling the timeline, and that's when I realized the Irish never experienced a dark ages. And to explain this kind of an impact on a culture, to understand what this means is vital. What the Dark Ages really does, and there's the bullshit we were told in school, there's the stuff they said to us then, but as a sociologist, the Dark Ages is something entirely different. The Dark Ages was a time period where there was no art, there was no education, there was no societal progress. That's literally the summation of the Dark Ages. It is a time period where there is no societal progress, and there wasn't, which is why the next era is referred to as the Age of Enlightenment, is because, boom, there's suddenly progress. And it was a massive step back to figure out what's going on with the Dark Ages. And the Dark Ages and the Roman Empire was always a huge anomaly for me. It's what attracted me to the entire topic to begin with, is because something's up. If you look at where Rome was culturally, basically you have this progression arc, and progression arcs do this. That's it. That they only go up, but not our culture. Western civilization did this. It did this, and then it did this, and then it did this. Literally. Ireland doesn't have that. Ireland doesn't have that. And I was for decades trying to figure out what happened that we had this massive drop, what caused the Dark Ages. No one seemed interested in this. Scholars never explored it. So I did. And that's when I found Alexandria, and in the year 380 CE, Christianity was declared the religion, and the same year they destroyed the entire city of Alexandria. And Alexandria was the world's capital of education. It was the epicenter of education of the ancient world. Now, there were actually two hubs, and the second hub was Ireland. And after Alexandria was destroyed in 380 CE, 500 CE, 120 years later, that is the mark of the Dark Ages beginning. So in destroying this city, this entire educational hub, it literally ended our educational progression, our societal progression, and it plunged us into, it took us back to ground zero. So we had to restart our entire cultural progression over. Now, it was around 460 CE, within that 120-year span, that the Roman Empire looked to Ireland and they said, we need to take out Ireland. So they brought in St. Patrick to do the job. Now everyone knows the story of St. Patrick, how he saved the Irish. But what did he really do? And when I sat down and I started to study the different cultures and the progression, the cultural progression of Ireland versus the cultural progression of Western civilization, they didn't have a Dark Ages. And what we're told St. Patrick did was he saved them from genocide and persecution of the Roman Empire. That's what we are taught, is that he saved them from persecution and preserved their culture. Let me explain what he really did. He preserved their ethical progression so that their cultural progression did not reset, which means there is this point of ethical progression that the entire world experienced, and Ireland was able to follow it without any interference. The Western culture made it to 380 CE, and it tanked, and they had to start it back over again from a different point. So what it means is I have a control group. That's what it means. It means I now have a control group. A control group in science is when you sit down and you are doing research on anything, you want to have a baseline. You want to have a starting point of, in a perfect situation, what would this look like? Uninhibited, without interference. And that is your control group. That is your archetype. And everything else you do after this point gets compared to the archetype, to the control group. Without a control group, you can't do research. Without a control group, you can't do research. I now have a control group. So what did St. Patrick do? St. Patrick gave me a control group. That's what St. Patrick did. St. Patrick preserved the ethical progression and natural evolution of the Irish. So I literally have an entire culture that's preserved in such a way that their ethical progression developed completely without interference, while everybody else experienced the Dark Ages and had to reset. So now we can take our Western culture and compare it to Irish culture and compare to see where we would have been if we had not evolved, if we had not had Christianity. It also answers the big question, what would our world look like if we did not have Christianity? I have the answer, because we have Ireland. So I needed to speak to people, Irish, inside that culture to see what exactly is different from theirs to ours. So I will be conducting 100 interviews. And I started yesterday speaking to one. Now, I have a massive experience. I have a lot of people in my life who are Irish. When I first came to New York City, I did nothing but hang out in Irish bars with the Irish. So I'm very familiar with their culture already. I'm already like, I get it. They're my people. And I was able to ask very vague but deliberate questions, looking for specific clues. And what I walked away with yesterday was confirmation that this is solid. I'm still going to be doing the research, of course. I'm still going to be doing the 100. But what she said was literally spot on to what I've heard a million times over from other Irishmen. Western civilization is at the fourth ethical perspective. It is very hierarchical in mindset. It is what I refer to as a foundational. What this means is they haven't even mastered the foundations of a culture yet. The ethical foundation of a culture is courage, vulnerability, trust, and self-control. If you can't even do that, self-regulation is also a major part of this. So if I were to sit down and say, what are the ethical foundations of any culture? It is courage, vulnerability, trust, self-control, and self-regulation. I give that list, and there's probably a lot of people who go, oh yeah, no. Yeah. The Irish have mastered this. The cultivators are the next stage. The cultivators have mastered accountability. They have mastered self-value, justice, kindness, equality. And there is no hierarchy. Everybody is equal, including the self. They have learned humble, humility. They have learned how to value community and basic humanity. This is the cultivators. So Western culture is averaging around the fourth ethical perspective. The Irish, based off of the answers I got, are at 10th, which means they have mastered foundational living. They've mastered cultivation, and they've mastered the 7th, 8th, and 9th ethic, which is communication, connection. That's a big one. Human connection. Foundationals are huge on the sciences. They are huge on making physics works for you. They are huge on when you look over at cultivation. Cultivation is all about community. It's all about connection. And the 7th, 8th, and 9th is about a healthy connection. It is about mastering the connection. It is about hospitality, empathy, compassion, and sharing. When I asked her about how's the emotional fluidity, which is the 10th ethic, the whole thing stopped. She was like, yeah, we don't do that. It was quite amusing. We had a long conversation about the discipline, the emotional discipline that the Irish experience. And she gave multiple cultural examples of some high publicity media that really rattled the country a few years ago. And the general consensus, like what the media was saying, what the Irish people were saying about it. And they ended up doing a lot of exercises to bring awareness to emotional allowance, emotional fluidity. And as expected, she also said that there was a divide with men and women, that men struggled with this more than women. But allowing your emotions and talking about your emotions is where the culture seems to be stopped, which is normal. Every culture, every person, when it comes to the ethics, you have a trial. And when you get to the trials, you have to overcome the trial. And the 10th ethical perspective trial is learning to allow your emotions. Learning to allow your emotions. And once you do that, you move into the 11th. It is a very, well, I didn't have a problem with it. Yeah. You know what? When you're at the 10th ethical perspective, it is easy. But if you are not, it's going to be hard because you're learning it out of order. So if you are at the 4th ethic and you're trying to learn emotional fluidity, it's going to be hard because you've got other stuff to learn first. The 10th ethic requires the foundation of all the other 9 in order to pull it off. And if you don't have the full 9 ethics, you're not going to pull off the 10th. So by the time I got to the 10th, I had the 9 solid, so it was easy for me. So if you lack the 9, you're not going to be able to do the 10th. Now there's environmental, and then there's the cultural ethics, and then there's the individual. So she personally may not have been doing it. She personally may have been at a different ethic, but the culture is at the 10th. So the majority, based off of her reports, it was definitely embracing the 10th. She covered with me how they parent their children differently. What was acceptable, what wasn't acceptable, what was allowed, what she saw when she went to other children's houses when she was a child, how she saw other people being parented. We covered humility, we covered courage, we covered violence, we covered everything. And we covered that hospitality, the trust, very trusting culture. And they also know how to use discernment. They know how to use that equality. They have self-value, which is where we get the Fighting Irish from. They'll defend themselves. They don't take shit from anybody. Self-value, but they're also kind. So when I was looking at all of this and it was all coming out, and it was just beautiful. It was absolutely, it was part of it. And the biggest thing that really stood out to me the most was the lack of hierarchy. Children and grandparents are equal. There is no respect your elders. There's none of that. Children are respected as equal to an adult. There's no condescension. There's no turning down people. The example she gave from her mother, beautiful. The example she gave from her mother was literally teaching. This was extraordinary. Not only did her mother teach her in an example empathy, but her mother used imagination and third-person perspective to take her daughter's perspective, shift it into another perspective, look at the situation from another point of view, and empathize. That's how it's done. That is how it's done. And she explained the situation that her mother did this to her, with her, for her, at a time when she was angry with the person. So it was when she was at a heightened state of anger that her mother used empathy and projection of imagination to walk her through this empathetic example of, you need to think about her point of view. And it was extraordinary. So I was able to get more information. I collected some locations I'll be going to, and I literally have a few people who are bringing me Irish to interview and talk to more about this. This is extraordinary information. So I'm going in and we are going to be pursuing this further. But when I got the summation of her answers, it was very much there in the 10th ethical perspective, whereas the rest of Western culture is in the 4th. Now, what this means is I can now, and I have the information here, I'm going to be doing this today, is watching the historical progression. I have several books, and I'm going to be doing the history on it, so I can see when they hit which ethical markers, how long it took for the entire culture to move, and also the difference we saw. Now, one of the biggest things that really stood out to me is the Book of Kells. I don't know why the fuck I did not recognize this sooner, because I've studied the Book of Kells already. The Book of Kells were created in the 9th century. So I want to give you some perspective. In the 800 CE, when the Book of Kells were made, the Irish, well, Harold Bluetooth was connecting and doing communication networks in Norway. And the rest of Western civilization were fighting off barbarians from rape. So while the rest of the world, well, Western civilization, was fighting off barbarians from rape, the Irish were painting books of gold. That's the difference. That's the difference. That's what the Dark Ages was. So instead of surviving, the Irish could live, celebrate, grow, develop, evolve. Now, I've been assessing culture in Western culture, especially American culture, and I'm beginning to significantly believe that I'm saying fourth ethic. I would say we are closer to a second or a third ethical culture. And the reason why is because the gun shootings, the school shootings, those are third ethics. The Wild West is third ethics. In New York City, it's a fourth and fifth ethical culture here. In Los Angeles, it's a fourth and fifth ethical culture. But in the rest of the country, it's a second and third ethical perspective culture. The Wild West is not gone, which is why there are certain places in the country where if you shoot somebody, you get away with it. Think about it. There is no law. If the police and the enforcers are friends and can be paid off, and they do in a lot of these other places, we're talking second, third ethic. So I'm looking at it going, America on a whole, if you take away LA and New York City, the ethical country is closer to a third ethical perspective, which means ethically, we are still in the Dark Ages. That's what it means. And when I was looking at the contributions, not so much the contributions, but the situation with that, it's the Roman Christian Church really fucked this, that just really fucked this up. And this is literally the power of education. This is literally like right here, this particular point in our history. And then to sit down and watch how Ireland evolved completely unaffected because St. Patrick preserved their educational center. So they were able to completely develop properly with their ethics, the way that humans are supposed to evolve. So had the Christian church not existed, we would still be at the 10th ethical perspective. That's the difference. That's the difference. So I am going forth and pursuing more of this research and getting more information as far as what the households were like. I'm going to be uploading the questionnaire and the data. I want to, and I'm going, why just the Irish culture? Why not do all of them? And I'm like, of course. So I'm going to be putting up a questionnaire. And if you want to participate in the research, there's a questionnaire where you can go in and write down basically your experience. There's going to be just answer the questions. And then I'll be able to go through, look, and assess. It is imperative that I not hear about your heritage. What I'm looking at is your culture. The difference between heritage and culture is heritage is where your genealogy comes from, irrelevant. 100% irrelevant. There is your energy. Your energy comes from a place. And a lot of people really go to their energy, which is valid, but that's not what I'm looking for. So the energy is that thing where you may have been born in California, you may have been raised by a bunch of Caucasian people in California, but Japan is what calls you. That's your energy. That's not what I'm looking for. That's irrelevant to this study. If you are Korean living in Los Angeles, but you are like 4 generations in, don't care. That is heritage, irrelevant. The culture is where you grew up. If your parents came from China and they moved to California, and you are your first generation living in the United States, and your parents came from China, and they might be speaking to you in Chinese, Mandarin at home, your culture is mixed, both Chinese and American. That data is not going to be useful to me. That is not going to be useful. I cannot have that information because there's too much anomaly, there's too much mixed data. I literally need pure cases. The pure cases are the people who grew up, born and raised in a culture matched to their parents' culture. So when I was looking for people to speak to yesterday, I was looking at, they had to be born and raised in Ireland by parents who were born and raised in Ireland, who came to America, living in New York City, and then they could compare. That's what I'm looking for. So if you were born, raised in France, born, raised by French people, and then you came to America and you're comparing, that's the information. If you are born, raised in France, parents lived in France, and you visited America, that's the information I need. If you were born and raised in France, parents are French, and you're still living in France, that's the information I need. But if you were born and raised in America or born in another country and you were raised in America, that's not what I need. That's not what I need. The culture is literally the environment and the genetic, not the genetic, the practices that were raised with you. It must be consistent. Basically, it's, and this is where you've got the parents wanting to do what their culture taught them to do, but the environment is giving, and this is where you get interference. And it's the interference that I can't have. So we'll go through it, and there'll be questions. So if you're not sure, just go through it. And it is basically if you were moving around a lot as a child, if you were changing cultures a lot, if you're an army brat, can't take army brats for this because that's going to really skew the data. I can look at data for army brats to see how their ethics and what they dealt with. That's a whole nother thing. Foster children, foster parents. See, if you're all in America, that's because the culture is going to be, yeah. And this is where, yeah. I'm trying to figure out if I would want, and I want to say, yeah, if you're born in America, raised in America, say it's, I need you to leave. I need you to leave. Born in America, raised by Americans, and then you go to a different country, then I want your opinion of how it's different. Because the thing is the comparison, and the questions that I'm looking for is how your culture compares to other cultures. But you have to leave the culture to see it. I can look outside into another culture and tell you what I look like or what it looks like from the outsider, but now that's biased. I need to get into their perspective to see it. And when you are in another culture and you step into it, when you move into another culture, you're stepping into their culture. I can tell you how New York City is different from everyone else because I moved here. So now I'm living in their culture. So now I can go, yeah, this is how New York City is different from everybody else because I lived here. Visiting does not cut it. No, visiting does not cut it, which is true of anywhere. You can't visit a place and think you know it. You have not experienced it if you have not lived there. It's a completely different experience when you don't live there. So this is the data I'm collecting at the moment. I am going to be doing all the countries, like all the cultures. I'm probably going to do this for the rest of my life. But the reason why I am looking so strongly at the Irish right now is because they're my control group, because they have it's a culture that I've studied, that I'm already familiar with. Same thing with with the Roman Empire. I'm already familiar with Western civilization. So I'm not going to be taking a look at Japan as a control group. I don't think they had a dark, they didn't have a Dark Ages, but I didn't study them. So I can't sit down and use them as a control group because I don't know anything about them. And also, they had no connection at all with the Roman Empire. Whereas the Celts did. They had a relationship with the Roman Empire. So, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. Thank you so much. And as I go through, and like the whole Irish series is literally, it's all of my research. It's as I find things and as I make realizations and connect the dots, then I'm going to be pulling it all together. So thank you so much. And may the kindest of words always find you.